Hello everyone, my name is Arjun Karnam, and I'm here with you with another AP Human Geography review video. This time it's Unit 6, and I'll be going over Chapter 9. And so I'll be going over Chapter 9, which is a chapter on development. So let's jump right in and ask the most general question, what is development? The textbook defines development as the process of improving material conditions of people through diffusion of knowledge and technology. And so already, after reading this definition, you can tell how broad the statement is. It doesn't exactly say, alright, development is having this, or development is having that. It's left to you. If someone feels that, okay, I think health is a paramount issue, and a country that has a well-built health infrastructure is therefore the most developed. And someone might disagree with them and say, I think, okay, health is important, but not as important as education. Education is more important, and therefore the country with the highest education should be more developed. And so already you can see the kind of disparities that are forming here. And so you see that there's many different indicators that a person can use to categorize countries into various development stages. And talking about categorizing, we have two overarching uh, areas where we categorize countries into either an MDC, or developed country, or an LDC, a less developed country. And so, simply, an MDC is further along the development continuum than an LDC. And so, when we talk about development, we also want to talk about the geographic distribution of development, and we can do that using the north-south split. We're going to be going over this a little bit more in depth when we go about HDI, so we can actually compare developments. But let's just do a brief overview of it. The north-south split is at roughly 30 degrees north, and if you look at this line, yeah, it's definitely not straight. And so, because it has to go past country borders and such, so, but it's roughly at 30 degrees north, and it's also called a Brent line. And so, what it acts as is it separates the north and the south, and it's considered a socio-economic and political divide. And in this case, what we're separating is the north, which is often considered the richer, the higher developed area, and the south, which is the poor, less developed area. Well, albeit Australia is a special one. And so we'll go a little bit more in detail on this on the next slide. And so this brings us to HDI, and this is a way of actually quantifying development. And so it stands for the Human Development Index. It is created by the United Nations in order to measure the development of countries around the world. And before we were talking about how we can have a variety of indicators. And so the United Nations has grouped them together into three main categories: economic indicators, social indicators, and demographic indicators. There's two different HDI sets. There's the old, or statistics that we use. There's the old one, which was used up till 2010, and then there's a new one, which we've been using ever since 2010. So let's go over them and talk about the differences and why they changed. The old HDI uses literacy rate as a social indicator, life expectancy as a demographic indicator, GDP per capita as the economic indicator, and gross enrollment ratio as another social indicator. And in the new HDI, we see average years of schooling and expected years of schooling as our social indicators. We see GNI per capita as our economic indicator, and again, we see life expectancy as our demographic indicator. And so, besides the demographic indicator, everything else was changed and swapped out for something else. So the question is, why did they do that? So let's do this step by step. For the economic indicator, they changed it from GDP per capita, which is basically the amount a country makes within its own borders, to GNI per capita, which is the amount of country makes throughout the whole world. And so, at the beginning, this may seem like, hey, what's the difference? But imagine if there's a person, a United States citizen, living in Canada. He has his business in Canada, but he's paying to the US. This would technically be an asset of the US, and thus it would be included under GNI per capita, but not under GDP per capita. So they probably switched to GNI per capita in order to have a more uh, a better estimate, better understanding of the country's actual wealth. Next is our social indicators. So we changed from literacy rate and gross enrollment ratio to average years of schooling and expected years of schooling. You may ask why, and that's because if you think about it, literacy rate does not set the bar, the standard, very high. All it measures is a percentage of people who can read and write over the age of 16 or 15, while average years of schooling actually take into account how much education a person receives. So under literacy rate, somebody who like a college, like someone who got the doctorate, is viewed the same as someone who maybe just went to elementary school in a country, learned how to read and write, and dropped out to do whatever, and is like now 16. It views them equally. They're essentially the same. But in actuality, we know this is not the. There's quite a big education disparity between these two individuals, and so this is what average years of schooling and expected years of schooling try to bring out. They try to bring out how much education the country actually has, and so it sets a better better understanding of a country's education social levels. So, like I was talking in the beginning of the video, we can use several indicators in order to measure where a country is in terms of development. And so, going on by the categories that the United Nations set out, let's talk about a few other factors that we can use as indicators for development. Under economic, we could use GDP per capita. I already described what that is. Types of jobs, which is basically the sector that a percentage of the labor force is involved in. So like, alright, so 30% in primary, 40% in secondary, and 30% in tertiary. Productivity, which is basically the amount of money you're putting in to the labor and the raw materials compared to the amount of money that you're getting out of the end product. And for that, you also look at statistics like the value added. You see natural resources that a country has, which is, in my perspective, not really an economic. I guess it could be considered an economic factor, but it doesn't really show development. It more shows the potential for development. And then finally, we have consumer goods, which is basically showing what type of goods consumers in a country are and can buy. Then we are brought to the social category, and we already talked about the difference between education and literacy. And then there's health is also included under here, and then welfare programs that the government may provide, like in the U.S., Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and several others. And then finally we have demographic, and so under that we can use life expectancy, which we're using now. We can also factor in infant mortality rate, natural increase rate, crude birth rate, and again, there's several other indicators that we could use. We could count the number of radio towers, cell phone towers. There's several others that we could use in order to measure development, and these are just a few. So now, let's go into the economic sectors. Let's jump right in. We start off with the primary sector, which is simply extracting resources from the earth, and this includes mining, agriculture, and fishing. And so, over here, if we look at this beautifully illustrated graph I drew, pretty sure you're jealous. Anyway, if we look at this, we can see the kind of correlation as of the percentage of the workforce engaged in this particular sector as time or as the country becomes more developed. And so you see that at the lower end of development, a high percentage of the population of the labor force will be engaged in mining, agriculture, fishing in the primary sector. But as the country becomes more and more developed, these people will leave the primary sector in favor of better jobs in the secondary and the tertiary sectors. Our next sector is the secondary sector, and this is primarily turning raw materials into finished products, and examples of this would be manufacturing and industry. And if we look over here, I was actually able to find a pre-made picture for this one. We see that if we look at the lower end of development, there's not going to be many people in the workforce engaged in secondary. But as we go on near this middle point, we see the peak of the secondary sector. But then as we go on, more people will do just like what they did to the primary sector and leave the secondary sector in favor of better jobs in the tertiary sector. And finally, we have the tertiary sector, which is the service sector of the economy, and out of it comes the quaternary and the quinary sectors of the economy. And quaternary is research jobs, and quinary is the high level decision making, which is basically CEOs and people who don't actually do much in terms of the other sectors, but they make high level decisions that affects all of the other sectors. And so here we have the graph. Ignore the 45 degrees. As the country becomes more and more developed, more of the workforce will be engaged in tertiary, quaternary, and quinary sectors of the economy. And so, when we're talking about the HDI, it's important to group this spatially and find out the geographic distribution of regions and the HDI they have, and some of the characteristics of these regions. And so, that's what we have right here. So let's start off with Western. We're going to start off with the regions that are considered more developed, and let's start off with Western Europe, which has an HDI of 0.93. And for this, due to the European Union, we have noticed a more unified region in an area that has been in turmoil over cultural and ethnic differences in the past. And with many of the economic barriers being removed in the area through the European Union, Western Europe has become one of the world's richest trading blocs, and that's why that's one of the reasons why it can have sustain such a high HDI. For Anglo America, North America, it has an HDI of 0.94, and an attribute of this is because North America has many natural resources and agricultural land to fuel development, and is one of the world leaders in terms of tertiary services, namely those in the technical sector of the economy. Next, we have the South Pacific at 0.92, and they have relatively high HDI, but what makes the South Pacific different is that they're not as central to the global economy because they don't have that many people in them, and they're in a kind of peripheral location of the world. The HDI of the countries in this, namely Australia and New Zealand, can be compared to MDC's because it's quite high. Also, they're mainly exporters of food and other resources to the United Kingdom, which was their former colonizer. And what makes them different is that their economies are kind of tied with Asia, and so they're kind of like them in Eastern Europe are kind of like the odd ones out here. And so, okay, and then next we have Eastern Europe at 0.80. Interestingly enough, this is the only region in the world where the HDI has dropped considerably over the past 2 decades. This is because the region, as you well know, is going through communism withdrawal. Basically, the communist governments fell 2 decades ago, and now they're having to go through the process of rebuilding their economic markets, the way they want to do it, and they had to reform the entire economy over the past few years. And also, it may have dropped because maybe under the Soviet Union there may have been some over-reporting going on. Possibly, there have been speculations. Anyway, and finally, for our 5th MDC, we have Japan. And while we're talking about Japan, let's talk about the 4/5 Asian tigers/dragons. So Japan has an HDI of 0.858. Japan being so developed, it's kind of a surprise if you look at it from a specific standpoint, because if you just uh, take a step back and look at Japan.